So our last presentation today, topical presentation on conservation challenges, will be from Catherine Wightman with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And Catherine is presenting on land use development in the sagebrush biome. So Catherine, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for your continued attention this afternoon. I'll be talking about land use and development, so those topics other than mining and energy that we heard about earlier. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge my chapter co-authors, Adrian Monroe, Vicki Dreitz, and Heather McFerrin. Next slide, please. So there are over 300 million people in the US, and our population, human population, is continuing to increase. Our Western landscapes play an important role for meeting the increased demands of our human population for energy, agricultural products, housing, and recreational opportunities. And these potential change agents on the landscape can be an opportunity or a challenge, and most land use decisions involve these trade-offs. For example, conversion of native sagebrush systems to cropland agriculture can result in direct habitat loss for sagebrush obligates, such as greater sage grouse and brewer sparrow, but grain and alfalfa provide foraging opportunities for game species, such as mule deer and waterfowl. New residential developments and recreational activities can bring invasive plant species and domestic pets, but also serve our growing human population and bring economic resources to our communities. So in this presentation, I will talk about some of these challenges and the opportunities for the topics of conversion to cropland agriculture, grazing management, infrastructure, residential development, and recreation. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see in red, in the map on the lower right-hand corner in red is the extent of the current conversion, and then the black line outlines the sagebrush biome. So initially, during the homesteading era, about 10% of the sagebrush biome was converted to cropland agriculture, and these were primarily the most productive soils. And as you can see, most of the contemporary conversion is in eastern Washington and eastern Montana, in areas where there tends to be wetter and more productive lands. The risk of continued conversion does continue on private lands, which are over half of the rangelands across the West. And in these areas that are more productive, even more than half is privately owned. So this means that the decision to convert or not to convert is primarily a voluntary decision by private landowners. And while there are some disincentives to conversion, there are also, unfortunately, some incentives. Things like commodity markets, crop insurance, and other safety nets to risk in federal policy and technological advances may serve as incentives for additional conversion. And once converted, even when we try to restore it, it can take the equivalent of a person's entire lifetime to recover. Next slide, please. So the map at the top of this slide is nape imagery from central Montana. The line in the middle is actually a county road that runs north-south. And on the west side of the county road, you see native intact sagebrush. On the right side of the county road, you can see that the native habitat has been converted to cropland. And I found the difference in the spectral signal quite striking and wanted to share this image with you all. And some of the examples of what this means on the landscape for wildlife is that we found that when tillage rates exceed 21 to 25%, it can lead to abandonment of leks by sage grouse. And in fact, in Montana and Wyoming, 96% of all leks are surrounded by less than 15% of cropland. And this demonstrates the importance of large intact landscapes for this species. Songbird communities are also seeing edge effects. So we're seeing community shifts from more specialists to more generalists. And we're seeing increase in next predation and decreases in reproductive success. We're also seeing some impacts on pygmy rabbits. They may suffer direct mortality at the time of tillage and converting, but they can also be indirectly impacted through the reduction in forage and cover, home range abandonment, and increased predation. So most of the tillable areas within the range have already been converted. However, there's some CRP lands on deep soil in eastern Washington that have been replanted with a sagebrush component and are supporting some active pygmy rabbit burrows. Now, some sagebrush species are benefiting from agricultural lands for food resources. For example, mule deer are taking advantage of the grain. We're seeing some increases in corvids and jackrabbits. Sage grouse will use alfalfa fields during the brood rearing season. And then lastly, we're trying to understand a bit more about the invertebrate communities and how they are impacted by cropland conversion, but some recent research suggests that the communities may be reduced in diversity and abundance in those converted systems. Next slide, please. So the map on the right of your slide now shows the areas that are protected from conversion. So anything that is in white within the sagebrush biome is considered unprotected. And it's not coincidental that most of the areas that are prone to conversion, i.e. have the deeper and the wetter soils, are also the least likely to be protected. We have some tools that we can bring forward, such as permanent conservation easements and long-term leases. So for example, in Montana, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks holds 200,000 acres of conservation easement in the sagebrush system and an additional 250,000 acres of 30-year leases that are also protecting sagebrush in the eastern part of the state. There are some cost share programs to help ranchers with sustainable ranching and help them continue to make the decision to continue ranching versus converting. And these are cost share programs with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, such as EQIP. There's some state programs, there's Partners for Fish and Wildlife, landowner agreements, and some granting organizations that are helping to provide incentives to not convert. In some parts of the range, the Conservation Reserve Program has been a good tool. In Eastern Washington, they found some success with restoring some sagebrush through the CRP. However, on the east side of the range, most of the CRP plantings do not include a sagebrush component, and so it's not functioning as a very viable landscape tool at this time. We have some community-based collaboratives and initiatives that are really helping to move the needle on protecting our native range from cropland conversion. One of these is the Rancher Stewardship Alliance, and we'll hear a presentation from them tomorrow in the case studies. And so we look forward to that presentation. We can learn more about how local producers are working together to steward their range and support their local economies through cost shares and incentives and partnerships. Next slide, please. So the most common widespread use of sagebrush grasslands is grazing, but it's important to differentiate between the poorly managed grazing that we saw at the turn of the previous century and the contemporary well-managed grazing that we're seeing on much of the landscape now. So poorly managed grazing can lead to reductions in perennial grass and forbs, compaction of soils, and decreased water quality. While well-managed grazing can reduce fuel accumulation, making systems more resilient to wildfire, and can stimulate perennial grasses, which help prevent the establishment of invasive annual species. Therefore, grazing can be a positive management tool, but has the potential to be detrimental if used inappropriately. The impacts on wildlife from grazing are typically dependent on the plant community attributes. So, for example, at certain scales, trends in sage-grouse populations may correspond with the timing and the level of grazing. However, sagebrush obligate songbirds are likely unaffected by grazing since they show little association with grass cover. the benefits of grazing do have some potential trade-offs when we think about some of the infrastructure that is needed to support grazing, such as fences that may impede wildlife movements for animals such as pronghorn, may cause direct collision and mortality for sage grouse, or potentially attract corvids and other predators. Next slide, please. So sustainable livestock grazing can help maintain and enhance sagebrush systems at scale. There's some federal and state programs such as EQIP and other infrastructure and grazing management assistance that can help make sustainable ranching profitable for producers. Again, keeping ranchers ranching. Management plans can help support wildlife habitat on rangelands. For example, the BLM and the Forest Service have incorporated grazing management standards specifically to support sage-grouse habitat. And state and conservation organizations that hold conservation easements often include management plans that are designed to support sustainable long-term management of the rangeland. There's also some innovative solutions. So a couple of examples of those. The Nature Conservancy has a grass bank in northeastern Montana where producers can graze their cattle on the grass bank for reduced leasing costs in exchange for implementing conservation practices on their home ranch. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So some of the other infrastructure that we see out on the landscape are linear features. And here we're talking about roads and pipelines and railroads that may or may not be associated with energy development. So these linear features do have a direct footprint, but they also have indirect impacts that can extend well beyond the physical footprint. For example, interstates and major paved roads cover 0.1% of the land area, but influence 38% of the landscape when indirect impacts are included. Some of the greatest areas of impacts are the Columbia Basin, the Wyoming Basin, and the Colorado Plateau. We also can see from these linear features, they can function as barriers to movement or cause disturbance from level of traffic and associated noise. So what we're finding is mule deer and sage grouse show a greater response to areas with higher densities of highly trafficked roads, suggesting an interaction between density of roads and traffic volume. Changes in roadside vegetation can lead in shifts in community too. And pygmy rabbits may also avoid roadsides. We're also seeing some more vulnerability to invasive species through disturbed vegetation. So for example, pipelines are typically buried and then revegetated. And although the disturbance is limited temporally, there is a potential for increases in invasive plant species. Next slide, please. So some solutions that are currently being implemented for the impacts from some of these linear features are seasonal closures. So for example, the Forest Service in Gunnison closes the roads seasonally during the Gunnison sage-grouse lucking season. Overpasses and underpasses have been used with some success. There's the People's Way project on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana that's resulted in 39 crossing structures and about 9 miles of wildlife exclusion fences. Wildlife vehicle collisions were reduced by 80% through that project. Colorado also has a very impressive project that has resulted in 90% reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions. We're seeing increased collaborations between states, wildlife agencies, and Department of Transportation. And then we're seeing in some states that indirect impacts from these linear features are being considered in some of the state sage-grouse mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. Tall structures such as transmission lines and cell towers share some of the same challenges as linear features. They are obviously linear features, but they have some unique challenges too because of their height over the landscape. We're seeing some direct mortality of avian animals hitting the power lines. but we're also seeing an avoidance and sensitivity to some of the power that is being generated through these systems. These vertical structures have a much more extensive indirect impact, and we have seen this in the distance to transmission lines that impact sage-grouse populations, and we're seeing that tall structures provide perching and nesting structures for raptors and corvids, and likely lead to an increase in predator densities. The Avian Powerline Interaction Committee has developed some voluntary guidance for minimizing impacts to birds from transmission and distribution lines. And so, for example, Colorado has used this voluntary guidance to change the design of some existing transmission lines to reduce impacts to Gunnison sage-grouse. And in Montana, a local utility co-op has agreed to bury existing transmission lines in sage-grouse habitat as mitigation for new development elsewhere. Next slide, please. Another land use that we see in the West is residential development. The map on this screen shows the areas of human modification in the sagebrush biome, and many of these are cities and human communities such as Salt Lake City, Reno, Boise, Spokane. However, we're also seeing places in Colorado and in other areas that have a lot of recreational amenities. We're seeing this dispersed population growth, and this rural development is, and this dispersed growth is 5 to 10 times the footprint as the urban footprint in the sagebrush system. Just as an example, in Montana, 50% of new homes are on 10 acres or larger lots. And we're seeing some shifts from these residential, causes of these residential developments are shifting our wildlife communities towards non-native species and lower species richness. We're seeing decreases in bird abundance and increases in domestic cats. Next slide, please. So as we've already established, the majority of rangelands are in private ownership. However, residential development is primarily voluntary. Some local governments are typically establishing the policies, but there are some examples of where states are working with those county governments to protect important wildlife habitats, such as Montana's model subdivision recommendations for wildlife. There's also some voluntary incentives such as conservation and long-term leases and agreements that we talked about for cropland agriculture, and they are also effective for residential development. And then some work out of Wyoming has really helped us think about targeted conservation and the value of thinking about where to prioritize our resources. And their research has showed that $250 million of targeted conservation easements that limited development could avert an additional 9 to 11% of declines in sage-grouse populations. The same amount of money for conservation easements in Wyoming would likely have limited impacts on sage-grouse populations if they were applied randomly. And next slide, please. The last land use that we covered in our chapter was recreation, and certainly recreation is good for individuals, it's good for our communities, it builds strong economies. However, it does need to be managed to minimize some of the negative impacts. So for example, lead ammunition can have detrimental impacts on non-target species during the hunting season, so things like eagles, ravens, and coyotes. Antler shed hunting may stress ungulates during winter. Disturbance from OHV use can lead to songbird nest abandonment near trails. And other species typically move in response to human activity, which can be energetically costly. Shooting and motorized use has led to wildfire in Colorado and elsewhere. So we're seeing some increased efforts by federal and state land management agencies to manage recreation through road closures, seasonal closures, and established campsites. So for example, the BLM and the Forest Service are concentrating camping sites and closing roads during sensitive seasons, State agencies are closing wildlife management areas to protect important winter sagebrush range for ungulates. Next slide, please. So lastly, I want to just summarize that many of the land use change agents that we discussed in this presentation and in the others today, they don't occur alone, and the impacts of each land use is related to the other stressors on the landscape. So for example, the cumulative human footprint influenced sage-grouse luck attendance across the range, regardless of the type of anthropogenic stressor. There are some tools, for example, the density and disturbance calculation tools that are being used to assess that cumulative anthropogenic disturbance. And there's an example here on the map on the top center of your screen. But by expanding these tools to the entirety of the sagebrush biome, it would help with conservation planning and evaluating our trade-offs. So to summarize, land use decisions require the careful balance of human and community needs with wildlife habitat impacts. A continued partnership and support for planning tools and targeted actions can help us thoughtfully conserve the sagebrush biome for people that are living on the landscape or relying on products from the landscape, and for the ecosystem services of the biome, such as wildlife habitat and quality water supplies. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Catherine. Really appreciate that presentation. And I am looking to see if we have any questions for you. I don't see any that have come in writing. Looking for any hands. If anyone has any questions? Yes, do have a question for you, Catherine. Does the DDCT really assess the cumulative impacts or just document the amount of impact?
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. It is how the DDCT can be applied that can help us assess the cumulative impacts on the landscape. You're correct that right now it is a tool that just shows us where those impacts are, but at least how we're using it in Montana, we then evaluate what is the percentage of disturbance on the landscape, and we can establish some thresholds and help to minimize that cumulative footprint.
All right, thank you for that. Any other questions that anyone has for Catherine? Okay, I think you were off the hook, Catherine, but really appreciate that. Very thought-provoking as we think about the breakout group discussion here next week. So thank you for that.